Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned the honor and privilege of your subscription. And of course, to everybody who's watching, if you enjoy this video, I would encourage you to take a few seconds to click that thumbs up button down below so you can show support for my channel. And if you'd like to take your support to the next level, you can visit eGuitarPlans.com or my Highline Guitars merch store. There's links in the description below, and any purchase you make there is going to help support this channel financially. You can also click the thanks button and leave a tip in the amount that you think is fair. So what I'm going to be talking about in today's video is I'm going to talk about finish testing. Now, what finish testing is, it's a process that I follow to ensure that the finish that I'm going to apply on a guitar is actually going to work. Now, typically I use a fairly narrow range of different types of finishes depending on the outcome that I want to achieve when finishing a guitar. However, occasionally I'll try new finishes because of new products that are available or a new order of applying those finishes. And then oftentimes I'm applying the finishes to wood that I've never actually used before. So whenever I'm doing something that's maybe not totally familiar, I like to test on scrap. And I would highly encourage everyone watching, if you're going to be applying finish on a guitar, test it on scrap first. Probably the biggest line of questions that I get on my channel for any type of guitar building process has to do with applying finishes. People are always wanting to know what products to apply, what order to apply them, whether different combinations of products will work together. And it can get really tedious for me to try to answer all those questions because there's so many of them and they're so widely ranging. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that the best way to answer those questions is to simply stress the importance of testing the finish on scrap wood before you commit to your guitar project. Now, unfortunately, some of you don't have that option because you don't have the scrap wood. Maybe you're building a kit, in which case what you have to kind of resort to doing is applying finish in unseen areas like a control cavity or pickup cavity or neck cavity. And that doesn't always give you the best indication of how the finish is going to perform, but it's really the only option you have. What you could do is, and this is something that you could explore, and that is to try to purchase scrap wood that is of the same species that your kit is built with. So if the body's mahogany or alder or maple, whatever it is, you can go to your local lumber supplier and see if you can source scrap that looks similar to what your kit was made from. And sometimes you can order it online. You can go on eBay and look for small pieces of wood that are of the same species. Now, that's not going to be a guarantee that your results of your finish testing are going to match how the finish is going to look when you actually apply it to your kit guitar, but it's better than nothing. And it can help you to avoid some of the real pitfalls of finish applications, such as incompatible products, such as spraying nitrocellulose lacquer over enamel paint and the problems that that can cause. This is true with just about every type of finish that's out there. In the years past, I had actually stated in videos that I had used just about every finishing product known to man. And at the time that was true. But in recent years, the last 4 or 5 years, the number of finishing products that have come to market is staggering, to say the least. So I really no longer can make that claim that I've used every single type of finishing product on the market. I'm constantly learning about new ones. But what's even more intriguing is that with all these different types of products coming out on the market, and there's some new technologies as well, some of them don't work well for what you're trying to accomplish. Others don't work well with one another. So testing becomes paramount. And I can't stress that enough. It's so much easier and safer to test than it is to ask me what my thoughts are on a particular finishing schedule. For one thing, the results that I get may appeal to me, but then when you do it yourself, it may not appeal to you. So you've got to test to make sure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you in closer and I'm going to show you how I'm going to test the finish for my 6-string multi-scale fanfret guitar. And I'm going to be doing it on a piece of scrap, and I'm going to show you the different products I'm going to use and hopefully what the outcome will be. The scrap that I'm going to be testing on is a cutoff from the blank that I used to make the body. And this is a piece of very lightweight wood called Philippine mahogany, also known as Luan, also known as Meranti. And it's a very lightweight piece of wood that has similar characteristics in terms of its grain appearance as mahogany, specifically your African mahogany. And the major difference is it's very, very light in weight. So it has, this particular piece is quarter sawn, so it has this interlocking grain pattern on the surface, which I think is going to look really neat. But what I want to do is I want to apply a color first, then I want to fix the color, and then I'm going to apply multiple coats of Sutherland Wells polymerized tung oil. This is their high luster formula. Now that sounds like a pretty simple process, but there's actually going to be a lot more involved. First of all, I'm going to be using a powdered aniline dye to color the wood. And this particular product comes from a company called Keda Dyes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put links to all the different products that I'm using here in the description below if you'd like to check them out yourself. But this particular product it's a powdered pigment and it's an aniline dye. Now what that means is, to make a long story short, is an aniline dye is a pigment that is ground much finer than most of your other powdered pigments. So it will mix into a liquid more readily, and then when you stain the wood, it's going to produce a much more intense, vivid color than any other type of dye. You know, I see guys using RIT clothing dye and food coloring and stuff like that. This is actually the type of dye that professional woodworkers would use. And when you purchase the dye from Keda Dyes, one of the options that's available is to use a kit. And that's what I've done. I use these kits all the time because what you get is you get 5 packets of color. 3 of them are your primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. And then they add black. And then they add brown. So you've got all the pigments that you would need to mix just about any color under the sun right from these 5 packets. And each one of these packets can mix up to a full quart of a very strong dye stain. But what I typically do is I mix it up just in the amount that I need for what I'm going to use. So for this particular project, I'm just going to mix up enough to stain, to do the test, and then to stain the body. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be mixing it up in one of these. This is just a plastic fluid bottle. I get these from Harbor Freight. They have the ounces indicated on the side here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up probably about 5 ounces of my dye stain. Now with Keda Dyes, you can mix it with water, alcohol. You can even experiment and try other bases such as your boiled linseed oil, your tung oil, nitrocellulose lacquer, whatever. But I do find that they mix more readily in either water or denatured alcohol. And what I'm going to use for this particular project is the denatured alcohol. And the reason for that is because when you mix the dye with water and then apply it to wood, as the water evaporates, the little fibers of wood on the surface will curl up and they'll dry that way. So what ends up happening is once you've applied the color and the water's evaporated and the surface is completely dry, if you run your fingers across the surface, it feels like coarse sandpaper. Even if you've sanded the surface to 400, 600 grit, it's going to feel rough, and that's called raising the grain. However, if I use the denatured alcohol instead, it won't raise the grain. So it works much better in terms of producing the color that I want without that rough surface. And there are other strategies that you can follow. For example, you can pre-dampen the wood with a damp cloth, dampened with water, let it dry, and then sand off or scrape off that raised grain before you apply your water-based dye. And that will hopefully reduce the likelihood or the significance of the raised grain. However, I find that doesn't always work. I have found that using the denatured alcohol as a base does work a lot better. So that's what I'm going to do. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up a little bit of brown and a little bit of the red for this particular project. And I'm going to mix it into, like I said, this plastic bottle. So I'm just going to grab a funnel here, and then I'm going to open up the jar of denatured alcohol, and I will pour that into the container to roughly about the 5-ounce mark. Okay, so even though I filled it up to 5 ounces, my method is not necessarily hyper accurate in terms of the ratios. And the reason is I'm not manufacturing guitars, so I'm not trying to create a duplicatable effect. Instead, I'm just trying to get the color reasonably close to what I want. So then to mix it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just the end of a plastic spoon here, and it doesn't take a lot. I'll probably put just a little bit more since I'm doing 5 ounces, maybe a little more. Okay, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take another plastic spoon, and then I'm going to get a little bit of the brown, because I'm not really looking for an intense red color. I'm looking more for like a reddish brown color. Okay, we'll start with that, and then I'm just going to kind of mix it up a little bit. Now, because the pigment doesn't mix as readily into alcohol as it does in water, it's a good idea to let this sit for probably a couple of hours and let that dye thoroughly dissolve into the alcohol before I apply it onto the wood surface. So I'm just going to let it sit, and we'll come back to it here shortly. Okay, so it's been sitting now for a couple of hours, so the dye should be thoroughly mixed in to the denatured alcohol. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a small amount onto a cloth here, and you can kind of get an idea of what it's going to look like. And then I'm just going to apply it here to a corner to see if that's the color that I want. Now, you can't really tell what the color is going to look like when it's wet. We have to come back later on here in a few minutes, once it's dry, so that we can tell what it looks like, what the color looks like when it's dry. Now, another good reason for using the denatured alcohol as a base is the fact that it does dry so quickly. So within minutes of applying the dye to the wood, most of it will have evaporated off and it will dry very quickly, so we can get an idea of what that color is going to look like. And if it isn't what I want, I can add more color, more dye pigment to the mix in order to achieve the color that I'm after. And then you can also use a hair dryer if you want to speed things up. Okay, it's thoroughly dry now, and it's really interesting how as you change the angle, the color intensity changes. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit more color to this just to kind of intensify it even more. Okay, so I went ahead and add a little bit more red and brown pigment to this bottle here just to sort of intensify the color a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and apply a little bit on here. Yeah, it's much darker. So I'm going to go ahead and apply it over the entire surface. So I have this nice kind of reddish amber brown color. I think looks really nice in this. And that's pretty much the color that I was shooting for. So I'll make sure I get it thoroughly covered. And what I have to do now is I have to let the alcohol thoroughly evaporate so that the surface will be completely dry. Now, it's important to understand that when you mix up a dye pigment into either alcohol or water, there's no binder present. It's not like mixing the pigment into, say, a water-based polyurethane or nitrocellulose lacquer or an oil-based or solvent-based clear coat material. That has a binder in it. So once you apply the color and it soaks into the wood and dries, the color would be locked into place. But since there is no binder in the alcohol, or if I were to use water, once this is dry, it could be easily reactivated by applying any sort of a liquid to the surface. So if I was to go straight to applying the tung oil, it's going to reactivate that dye and lift the dye up out of the wood and back onto the cloth that I'm using to wipe on the polymerized tung oil. So what I'm going to have to do is, as soon as it's dry, is I'm going to fix it. And there's a couple of different ways to fix it. What I'm going to use is this spray-on Minwax Helmsman spar varnish. You can also use like a spray-on shellac, like Zinsser spray-on shellac. But the reason why I like to use the Hellman spar varnish is because it protects that color from sunlight. So that should hopefully give it a little bit more UV protection. Although, in truth, UV protection is not that critical for a guitar. People ask me that all the time, how important it is to have UV protection. If you leave your guitar sitting in the sunlight, it's going to be a problem. But you shouldn't be leaving your guitar sitting in the sunlight. So, but I'm going to go ahead and I'll use the spar varnish. But I got to wait till this dries. And I'm just going to put down a single very light, thin coat. And that's it. And I'll let this dry. It's going to take about 24 hours. And then I can proceed with the next step. Okay, so it's been 24 hours and the spar varnish that I sprayed earlier has dried completely. And I am 100% confident that the color, the dye that I applied earlier, is locked in to the surface. Nothing I do is going to reactivate that dye. So I'm safe to start proceeding with the next step. However, there has been an unexpected result. And this is the reason why we test finishes, so that we can discover these issues before we commit to our actual project. And what happened is I have raised grain. And I'm not sure why that happened. When I applied the dye stain and let it dry, the surface was absolutely smooth. There was no raised grain whatsoever. I didn't discover this raised grain until after the spar varnish had dried. So clearly the spar varnish itself raised some of the grain. And I've actually experienced this before when I've had solvent-based products raise grain, because it can happen. It's not as common as it is when you're using a water-based finish, but it can happen. And I think in this case what happened was the spar varnish, when I sprayed it onto the surface, it soaked into the small wood fibers on the surface and caused them to swell, and they dried that way. So it's not exactly the same as raised grain that's caused by a water-based finish. This is more of like a grain swelling. So I think that's what's happened here. What I need to do before I can proceed is I'm going to lightly sand the surface with some 220 grit sandpaper, and I've just wrapped this around a piece of one of those giant rubber racers. And I'm just going to lightly sand just to knock back some of that raised grain. I have to be really careful here because I don't want to sand through and into that underlying color. If that were to happen, I would have to repair that spot with some of the dye stain that I've mixed up. So to avoid that, I'm just going to sand very lightly, just enough to knock down the high spots. And it doesn't take much. Right now, as I feel this, it's pretty smooth. A couple of spots where it's still a rough texture, but for the most part, it's feeling pretty good. The next step is to fill the grain, and I'm going to do that with my own custom grain filling mixture, and that consists of polymerized tung oil with mahogany sanding dust mixed into it, and the result is this thick, gooey, dark brown slurry, which I can then apply to the surface of the wood, and it will pack down into the grain, thereby filling it so that the surface will be nice and smooth. And to apply it, I'm just using a popsicle stick here and spreading it around. Yeah, I could also use a business card or an old plastic credit card as well. But the goal here is to pack the mixture down into the open poring grains where it will dry. And this will take probably about 12 to 24 hours for this mixture to dry. Okay, it's been over 24 hours since I applied my homemade grain filling mixture, and it is completely dried, and I'm really happy with the results. Not only is the filler completely dry, but it has filled in all the grain and pores. But because I used that mahogany mixed in with the oil, the grain structure is actually enhanced, which is what I was looking to do with this finish. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the high luster polymerized tung oil as my top coat. And what my plan is, I'm going to basically follow the same instructions that is provided on the Sutherland Wells website for finishing guitars. And that is to apply a coat, wipe off the excess, let it dry, then lightly sand the surface with 400 grit, apply another coat, let that dry, then sand the surface with 600 grit, then apply another coat, a third coat, let that dry, then level sand it or sand the surface with 800 grit, and basically just keep going in that same order. Apply a coat, let it dry, lightly sand it. And each coat will be sanded with progressively finer grits. And I can go as far as I want. I can apply as many coats as I want to, 4, 5, 6, 7 coats. And the more coats that I apply, the shinier and glossier the surface is going to get. So let's go ahead and I'll apply a liberal amount of the tung oil. So I will just let this soak in for a little bit. I'm going to wipe off the excess and I'll let it dry. And it's probably going to take 8 to 12 hours for this first coat to dry. Then I can lightly sand the surface with 400 grit and apply the next coat. Okay guys, so I have completed my finishing test and everything turned out pretty much as I had hoped it would. But one of the reasons we do testing is to identify potential problems or unexpected results. And I did identify one. I have decided that when I am filling the grain with my homemade mahogany sanding dust and polymerized tung oil mixture, I'm going to apply an application, cover the surface, clean it off, and then let it dry. Then I'm going to apply a second coat. And it's possible I may even apply a third coat because I'm still seeing some of the grain texture coming through on the surface. And I'm really hoping to get this surface absolutely smooth when I apply the polymerized tung oil by itself as a clear protective top coat. So I think that's probably the strategy I'm going to follow as I apply the finish on the actual guitar body. And that should be happening next week. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and got something out of it, and that you understand the value and the importance of testing a finish on scrap wood before you commit to your project. It is critical. You can ask people questions about how a finish might perform or how it will function, but until you actually test it yourself on the wood that you're using, you're never going to know for sure. And you could always be hit with an unexpected surprise, and you don't want that to happen on your actual project because trying to fix that can be a real challenge. So again, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if so, please consider giving it a thumbs up. Visit eguitarplans.com or my Highline Guitars merch store. Again, there's links in the description below. And you can also, if you would feel so inclined, click the thanks button and leave a tip in the amount that you think is fair. So until the next episode, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back as I continue with building this 6-string multi-scale fan fret guitar.